Keanu Reeves sat alone on a hard plastic chair near Gate 42 at Los Angeles International Airport. It was late, past 10 at night, and the terminal had emptied out. Most travelers had either boarded their flights or gone home. Only a few stragglers remained, a tired family dragging suitcases, a couple whispering over coffee, and a man in a security vest pacing slowly near the windows. Rain tapped gently against the glass, blurring the runway lights into soft yellow smears. Keanu wore his usual outfit, black coat, dark jeans, scuffed boots. No sunglasses, no hat, no attempt to hide. He didn't need to. People often didn't recognize him right away, especially when he wasn't on a red carpet or in a movie poster. Here, in the quiet hum of a nearly empty airport, he was just another person waiting. He held a paper cup of black coffee, barely touched. Steam had long since vanished. His eyes were fixed on the rain, but his mind was far away. It often wandered like this, especially at night, especially when he was alone. He thought about the old house in Silver Lake, the one with the creaky back porch and the lemon tree that never bore fruit. He thought about late-night drives with the windows down, music low, someone beside him who knew his silences better than his words. That someone was gone now. It had been more than 20 years. But time didn't erase everything. Some things stayed sharp, like shards of glass tucked deep in the chest, painful if you pressed too hard, but always there. Her name rarely left his lips in public, but in his thoughts, she was still vivid. The way she laughed when something surprised her, how she'd hum off key while making tea, the quiet strength in her eyes even on the hardest days, and then there was the baby, Ava. He never got to hold her. Never got to hear her cry or see her yawn. She was gone before she ever really arrived, and then, just months later, so was her mother. Gone in a flash of headlights and screeching tires on a wet Los Angeles street. Two losses so close together they felt like one long, unending fall. Keanu took a slow breath and blinked. The rain outside had picked up. A plane taxied past in the distance, its blinking lights cutting through the gloom. He shifted in his seat, trying to shake the heaviness. He wasn't here to dwell. He was flying to Toronto for a small event, a Q&A after a screening of an old film. Nothing flashy. Just a chance to talk about the work, thank the fans, maybe sign a few posters. He liked these quiet gigs. No cameras, no pressure. Just real people who loved movies. He checked his watch. Boarding would start soon. He stood to stretch his legs, rolling his shoulders. As he turned toward the departure board to confirm his gate, something stopped him cold. Not a sound. Not a voice. Just a shape. A movement. Across the concourse, near a shuttered newsstand, a woman stood facing the flight information screen. She wore a tan trench coat, slightly wrinkled, and held a small carry-on bag slung over one shoulder. Her dark hair fell just past her shoulders, damp from the rain. She tucked a strand behind her ear with a familiar, absent-minded gesture, fingers brushing the lobe, head tilting slightly to the side. Keanu's breath left him in a rush. His heart didn't just skip, it stopped. For a single, impossible second, the world narrowed to her. The airport noise faded. The rain, the announcements, the distant rumble of luggage carts, all of it vanished. There was only her. It was her, not someone who looked like her. Not a passing resemblance. This was her posture, her way of standing, weight on one foot, the other slightly turned out. The curve of her neck as she read the board, the way her coat hung just so, even the slight furrow between her brows as she concentrated. He knew that furrow. He'd traced it with his thumb 100 times. His hands went cold. The coffee cup trembled in his grip. He wanted to move, to call out, but his body wouldn't obey. He just stood there, frozen, watching as if blinking might make her disappear, or prove she was real. Memories crashed over him like waves. Her voice saying, "You're overthinking again," as she handed him a mug. The way she'd dance alone in the kitchen to old soul records. The night they sat on the porch after the ultrasound, silent but holding hands, both scared and hopeful in equal measure. And then, the phone call. The hospital. The unbearable silence afterward. He hadn't cried in public since. Not really. But right now, standing in the middle of an emptying airport, tears pricked his eyes. He blinked them back fiercely. The woman shifted, glancing at her watch. She turned slightly and the overhead light caught her profile. Keanu's chest tightened. It was her, but it couldn't be. He knew that. Logically, he knew. She was gone. Buried in a quiet hillside cemetery he visited every year. He'd placed flowers there just last month, yet here she was, or someone so close it hurt. He took a step forward without thinking, then another. His boots made no sound on the polished floor. He kept his distance, not wanting to startle her, not sure what he'd even say if he got close. "Excuse me, you look exactly like the love of my life who died 2 decades ago." That wasn't something you just blurt out to a stranger, but he couldn't look away. She pulled a boarding pass from her coat pocket and studied it, then looked up at the gate numbers. Her expression was calm, focused, ordinary. She wasn't searching for anyone. She wasn't lost. She was just traveling, living her life. And that was the strangest part. Because if this was her, if by some miracle she'd walked back into the world, she wouldn't be standing here alone, calmly checking a flight schedule. She'd be looking for him, wouldn't she, unless this wasn't her at all. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. A cruel coincidence. Grief playing games with his mind as it sometimes did in quiet moments. He'd heard other people talk about it, seeing a loved one in a crowd, hearing their voice in a dream so real it leaves you breathless upon waking. But this felt different. This felt solid. The woman started walking toward gate B12, her steps quick but unhurried. Keanu followed, keeping several yards behind. He told himself he wasn't stalking, just watching, just making sure. As she passed under a brighter set of lights near a charging station, he saw more clearly. Her hair was a shade lighter than he remembered. Her nose slightly more rounded, the way she carried her bag, over one shoulder, not across her body like Jennifer used to. Small differences, but they were there. Still, the resemblance was staggering, uncanny, enough to make his throat close up. She paused to check a text on her phone, and in that moment she looked up, right in his direction. Keanu froze. Their eyes met for less than a second. Hers were kind, curious, but showed no recognition. Of course they didn't. Why would they? To her, he was just a man in a black coat staring a little too long. She offered a polite, fleeting smile, the kind strangers give when they accidentally lock eyes, and turned back to her phone. That tiny smile broke something open inside him. It wasn't hers. Jennifer never smiled like that, polite, distant. Her smiles were full, sudden, like sunlight breaking through clouds. This woman was someone else. A stranger who happened to carry the ghost of someone he loved in her bones. Her face, her gestures. Keanu exhaled slowly, the tension leaving his shoulders. The world rushed back in, the hum of the air vents, the squeak of a luggage wheel, the distant voice announcing a final boarding call. He stood there for a long moment, watching her walk away. Not with longing now, but with a strange kind of awe. How strange, he thought, that the universe could stitch together a face so close to hers, down to the tilt of the chin, the arch of the eyebrow, and place her here, in this exact moment, in this quiet corner of an airport, as if to say, remember, but keep going. He turned back toward his own gate, his coffee forgotten on a nearby chair. His hands were steady now, his breath even. The rain outside had slowed to a drizzle. Somewhere beyond the clouds, stars were waiting, and somewhere inside him a quiet voice whispered, "She's still with you. Not in flesh, but in everything you are." He picked up his small duffel bag, adjusted his coat, and walked toward his flight, not running from the past. Not chasing a ghost, but carrying both with him, as he always had. The boarding announcement for his flight crackled over the speakers. Final call for passengers on Air Canada Flight 842 to Toronto. Keanu nodded to himself. Time to go. He didn't follow her out of curiosity. He followed because his feet moved before his mind could catch up. It wasn't stalking, it was something quieter, deeper. Like a part of him refused to let her vanish again without at least seeing her one more time. The woman walked with purpose, her heels clicking softly against the tile floor. She passed a row of empty shops, closed for the night, their windows dark except for the faint glow of emergency lights. Keanu kept a respectful distance, hands tucked into his coat pockets, eyes fixed not on her face but on the space just beside her, as if looking directly might shatter the illusion. Every step brought more clarity and more confusion. From behind, she was almost identical. The slope of her shoulders, the way her hair swayed with each stride, even the slight bounce in her step when she was in a hurry. But up close, small things began to shift. Her coat was newer, cleaner than the one Jennifer used to wear, which always had a coffee stain near the cuff and a loose button she kept meaning to fix. This woman's bag was sleek and modern, not the worn leather satchel Jennifer carried everywhere, stuffed with scripts, receipts, and half-finished poems. Still, the resemblance was so strong it made his chest ache. He remembered the first time he'd seen Jennifer, really seen her, not just as another face in a room, but as someone who mattered. It was at a party neither of them wanted to be at. She'd been standing by a window talking to no one, watching the rain. He'd walked over, not with a line or a joke, just a quiet hey. And she'd turned and something in her eyes said, "I've been waiting for you to notice me." Now, 20 years later, here was that same look, the same stillness in a busy place, the same quiet presence that seemed to slow time around her. The woman stopped near gate B12 and checked her phone again. A notification lit up the screen and she smiled, just a small lift at the corner of her mouth. It wasn't Jennifer's smile, but it was close enough to make his breath hitch. He stood near a pillar, pretending to check his own phone, though the screen was dark. He wasn't sure what he hoped to do. Talk to her, ask if she'd ever been to Silver Lake, tell her about the lemon tree that never bore fruit. That felt insane, selfish even. She had her own life, her own story. She wasn't a mirror for his grief, but then again, what if she knew? What if somehow she'd felt it too? That strange pull between strangers who share an invisible thread? He shook his head. He was letting his mind wander too far. Grief did that, made you reach for signs where there were none. Still, he couldn't walk away. A flight attendant called for final boarding on a nearby gate. Passengers began to line up, rolling suitcases and adjusting scarves. The woman glanced toward the line forming at B12, then checked her boarding pass again. She wasn't in a rush, but she wasn't dawdling either. She belonged here in this moment, heading somewhere ordinary, maybe visiting family, maybe starting a new job, maybe just escaping for a weekend. Keanu thought about all the ordinary things he and Jennifer never got to do. Grocery shopping on a Sunday morning, arguing over which movie to watch, waking up tangled in sheets laughing about nothing. Those tiny everyday moments that people took for granted, they were the ones he missed the most. He took a slow breath and stepped out from behind the pillar. His heart pounded, but his steps were calm. He walked toward her, not fast, not slow, just present. She looked up as he approached, her expression shifting from neutral to politely curious. No fear, no alarm, just the quiet awareness of someone used to navigating the world alone but kindly. "Hi," he said, his voice softer than he intended. It came out rough like he hadn't spoken in hours. She nodded slightly. "Hello?" There was a pause. Not awkward, just human, the kind of silence that happens when two strangers stand on the edge of something real. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. You reminded me of someone." She didn't roll her eyes or step back. She just looked at him, really looked, and something in her gaze softened. "Yeah," she said quietly. People say that sometimes. He wasn't sure what to say next. He wanted to explain, but how do you explain a lifetime of love and loss in an airport hallway at midnight? "I lost someone," he said finally, the words simple, bare. "A long time ago. And when I saw you, for a second I thought..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "I know it's not you. I know that." But it felt like she was saying hello. The woman didn't flinch. She didn't offer empty platitudes like she's in a better place or time heals all wounds. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, the way Jennifer used to when she was listening deeply. "It's strange, isn't it?" she said, "how memory works. One smell, one sound, one face, and suddenly they're right there with you again." He nodded. "Yeah, like they never left." She glanced toward the gate, then back at him. "I don't know her story," she said gently. "But if she loved you, she'd want you to keep living. Not just surviving, living. Laughing, traveling, seeing sunsets. Even standing in airports talking to strangers." He almost smiled. "You're probably right." A voice over the intercom announced final boarding for her flight. She sighed softly, not with annoyance, but with the quiet resignation of someone used to goodbyes. "I should go," she said, adjusting her bag. "Of course," he said quickly. "I didn't mean to hold you up." "You didn't," she said. And then after a beat, "Take care of yourself." He nodded. "You too." She turned and walked toward the jet bridge, her steps steady. He watched her until she disappeared through the doorway. No dramatic pause. No backward glance. Just a woman boarding a plane heading home or away. Her life continuing as it should. Keanu stood there for a long moment, the noise of the terminal returning in waves. The ache in his chest hadn't vanished, but it had changed. It wasn't sharp anymore. It was softer, like a bruise healing. He walked back toward his own gate, slower this time. His mind replayed her words. She'd want you to keep living. It wasn't advice. It was a gift. He thought about all the ways he had kept living, raising money for children's hospitals, showing up for friends in crisis, riding his motorcycle across the country just to feel the wind on his face. He hadn't shut down. He'd chosen kindness again and again, even when it hurt. Maybe that was how love survived, not in grand gestures, but in small, daily acts of courage. He passed a vending machine and bought a bottle of water, more out of habit than thirst. As he twisted the cap open, he noticed his hands weren't shaking anymore. His flight would board soon. He found an empty seat near a window and sat down, watching the rain finally stop. Puddles shimmered under the runway lights. In the distance, a plane lifted into the sky, its wings catching the last of the storm clouds. He pulled out his notebook, the one with the frayed edges and coffee rings on the cover. Flipped to a blank page. Didn't write anything grand, just 2 words. Thank you. He didn't know if he was thanking the woman, the memory, or the universe for this strange, tender moment. Maybe all 3. Outside, the sky began to clear. A sliver of moon appeared between the clouds. He closed the notebook and tucked it back into his coat. Somewhere, a life had ended too soon. But here, in this quiet airport, another moment had begun, not to replace what was lost, but to honor it, and that was enough. For now, it was enough. He didn't speak to anyone after she left, not because he was upset, but because words felt too heavy just then. He sat by the window watching the tarmac crews move under the floodlights, their silhouettes sharp against the wet concrete. The airport hummed with its usual late-night rhythm, rolling suitcases, muffled announcements, the occasional burst of laughter from a group of travelers. But to him it all felt distant, like he was listening through water. What had just happened wasn't a miracle. It wasn't fate or a sign from beyond. It was something quieter, more human. A moment of shared understanding between 2 strangers who, for a few minutes, saw each other clearly. That was rare. And precious. He thought about how most people would have brushed off his approach, maybe even called security. But she hadn't. She'd listened. Not with pity, not with discomfort, but with a kind of quiet recognition, as if she'd stood in that same place before, staring at a ghost only she could see. Maybe she had. Maybe everyone carries someone like that, a face, a voice, a laugh that lives in the back of their mind long after the person is gone. He pulled his coat tighter around himself. Not because he was cold, but because it felt like armor. Not to shut the world out, but to hold himself together. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his sister. You okay? You seem quiet. He smiled faintly. She always knew. Even from miles away, even without seeing his face, she could sense when the past had brushed against him. He typed back, yeah, just saw someone who looked like her. For a second, it felt real. Her reply came instantly. I know that feeling. Remember what Mom used to say? Grief is love with nowhere to go. Maybe tonight it found a place to rest. He read the message twice, then tucked the phone away, letting those words settle in his chest like a warm stone. Boarding for his flight began a few minutes later. He stood, slung his duffel over his shoulder, and joined the small line. No one recognized him. Not the gate agent, not the couple ahead of him arguing over seat assignments. Not the teenager with headphones blasting music loud enough to hear from 3 feet away. He liked it that way. Fame was useful when it helped others, but in moments like this, anonymity was a gift. As he walked down the jet bridge, the stale, recycled air of the plane hit him. The familiar mix of coffee, carpet cleaner, and faint plastic. He found his window seat, stowed his bag, and sank into the cushion. The seat next to him was empty. Good. He needed space to breathe. He didn't open a book or put on headphones. He just looked out the window as the ground crew gave the all clear and the engines began to whine. The plane taxied slowly, turning onto the runway. Raindrops still clung to the wing, catching the terminal lights like tiny stars. And then, Without warning, his eyes filled with tears. Not the kind that came from sadness alone. These were different, fuller, quieter. They weren't just about loss. They were about gratitude. Gratitude for the years he'd had, however short. Gratitude for the way love didn't vanish just because someone died. It changed shape. It lived in memories and habits, in the way he still made tea for two out of habit even now. He let the tears fall, just a few, and wiped them away with the back of his hand before anyone could notice. The plane lifted off smoothly, climbing through the low clouds. Los Angeles shrank below, its grid of streets, its hills, its endless sprawl, until it was just a glow on the horizon. He thought about the house in Silver Lake. He hadn't been back in years. Too many ghosts. But maybe one day he'd visit. Not to mourn, but to say hello. A flight attendant came by with water. He accepted it with a quiet, "Thank you," and she gave him a small nod before moving on. No fuss, no fanfare. Just two people being kind in the dark. He sipped the water slowly, watching the sky turn from gray to deep indigo. Stars began to appear, first one, then dozens, then thousands. Up here, above the noise and the traffic and the weight of the world, everything felt simpler. He thought about the woman again, not as a replacement or a symbol, but as a person. Where was she now? Was she looking out her own window, thinking about the strange man in the black coat who'd spoken to her with such raw honesty? Did she have someone she missed too? He hoped she was okay. He hoped her life was full of good things. Warm meals, quiet mornings, people who showed up when it mattered. Because that's what Jennifer would have wanted, for everyone to be okay. She'd been like that. Always checking in, always listening. Once, during a brutal press tour, she'd stayed up all night just to talk him down from a panic attack he didn't even know he was having. She never made a big deal of it, just sat beside him on the hotel balcony, wrapped in a blanket, watching the city lights until his breathing slowed. "You don't have to be strong all the time," she'd said. "You just have to be here." He'd carried that with him ever since. The plane leveled out, cruising now. The cabin lights dimmed. Passengers around him settled in, some sleeping, some watching movies, some staring blankly at the seat back in front of them. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to remember. Not the end. Not the hospital calls or the funeral or the unbearable silence that followed. He remembered the beginning, the first time she laughed at one of his terrible jokes. The way she'd squeeze his hand 3 times when she meant "I love you," their secret code. The morning she'd woken up and said, "Let's drive to the ocean." And they'd done it. No plan, just windows down and music loud and the Pacific stretching forever ahead. Those moments were still his. No one could take them, and maybe that's what the woman at the airport had reminded him of. Not that he'd lost something, but that he'd had something worth missing. That was a kind of blessing, too. He opened his eyes. The stars were brighter now, undimmed by city lights. He thought about Ava, his daughter he never got to meet. He'd never stopped wondering who she might have been. Would she have loved books like her mom? Would she have rolled her eyes at his dad jokes? Would she have been brave, kind, curious? He liked to imagine her as all those things, and in a way he honored her by trying to be those things himself. The flight attendant came by again, offering a blanket. He took it with another quiet thanks. As she walked away, he noticed the small pin on her uniform, a tiny silver heart. It reminded him of the necklace Jennifer used to wear, the one he'd given her for her birthday. Simple. No gemstones, just a heart on a thin chain. She'd worn it every day until the end. He never found it after the accident. Maybe it was lost. Maybe it was buried with her. He didn't know, but he didn't need to hold it to feel its weight. He pulled the airline blanket over his lap, not because he was cold, but because it felt like being tucked in, like someone cared. Outside, the world slept. Inside, he stayed awake, not in pain, but in peace. The encounter at the airport hadn't changed his past, but it had softened the edges of his present. He wasn't chasing ghosts anymore. He was carrying love forward. One quiet act, one honest moment, one starlit flight at a time. And that, he realized, was how you kept someone alive, not in longing, but in living. The flight landed in Toronto just after 5 a.m. The sky still dark but softening at the edges with the promise of dawn. Keanu stepped off the plane into the quiet hush of the early morning terminal. The air smelled different here, crisper, cleaner, with a hint of pine and cold pavement. He pulled his coat tighter, and followed the signs toward baggage claim, though he had no checked luggage. Just the small duffel over his shoulder, a notebook in his pocket, and the weight of the night still resting gently on his chest. He'd barely slept on the plane, not because he couldn't, but because he didn't want to. There was something peaceful about watching the world from above. Cities shrinking into constellations of light, rivers glinting like silver threads, the endless curve of the earth reminding him how small, yet how connected everything really was. He'd spent most of the flight thinking, not about loss, but about presence, about how showing up even when it hurts is its own kind of courage. A driver hired by the event organizers waited near arrivals, holding a sign with his name misspelled. Keanu smiled when he saw it, Keanu, and gave a small wave. The man, bundled in a thick jacket, looked startled for a second, then broke into a grin. "Sorry about the spelling," he said, shaking Keanu's hand. "My kid wrote it. Said it looked right." "No worries," Keanu replied. "Happens all the time." They drove through empty streets, past shuttered shops and snow-dusted parks. Toronto in winter had a kind of quiet dignity. No rush, no noise, just the steady breath of a city waiting for the sun. Keanu watched the neighborhoods blur by, thinking how every window held a story. A family eating breakfast, a student pulling an all-nighter, someone grieving, someone falling in love. Life in all its messy, beautiful forms happening behind every curtain. The hotel was modest, a boutique place near the theater where the screening would be held later that evening. No red carpets, no flashing lights, just a cozy lobby with warm wood floors and the smell of coffee drifting from the cafe next door. He checked in quickly, declined housekeeping, and took the elevator to his room on the 4th floor. Inside, he dropped his bag by the bed and walked straight to the window. The city stretched out below, still half asleep. He unzipped his coat but didn't take it off. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed, pulled out his notebook, and opened it to a fresh page. He didn't write much. Just a few lines. She wasn't her. But for a moment, love reached across time, and that's okay. He stared at the words for a long time. They weren't poetry. They weren't profound. But they were true. And sometimes truth was enough. He thought about all the ways he'd tried to outrun grief over the years, throwing himself into work, riding his motorcycle for days without stopping, giving away money so quietly no one knew it was him. None of it erased the pain. But none of it was wasted either. Because in trying to move forward, he'd learned how to be kinder, how to listen, how to show up for people even when he didn't have much left to give. That was Jennifer's legacy in a way, not in grand monuments or headlines, but in the quiet choices he made every day. The way he tipped generously, the way he remembered the names of crew members on film sets, the way he'd sit with a friend for hours without saying a word, just being there. He stood and walked to the bathroom, splashed cold water on his face, looked at himself in the mirror. His eyes were tired but clear. There was no despair there, just a deep, steady calm, like a lake after a storm. He called room service and ordered black coffee and toast. While he waited, he unpacked his duffel, a change of clothes, a worn copy of a Rilke poem, a small photo he never showed anyone, a candid shot of Jennifer laughing in the kitchen, sunlight catching the gold in her hair. He kept it tucked in the lining of his bag, not to dwell on, but to remember that joy existed even if it was brief. The coffee arrived. He carried the tray to the small table by the window and sat down. Sipped slowly. The warmth spread through him, grounding him in the present. Later that morning, he walked to a nearby park. The snow had stopped and the paths were freshly shoveled. A few joggers passed by, their breath visible in the cold air. He found a bench under a bare oak tree and sat, watching a squirrel dart across the grass, searching for buried treasures. He thought about his sister's text from the night before. Grief is love with nowhere to go. It had stayed with him. And now, sitting here in the quiet of a Canadian morning, he understood it better. Grief wasn't something to fix. It was love that had lost its home. But love could find new places to live, in kindness, in memory, in the way you treat strangers. He pulled out his phone and called her. She answered on the second ring. "Hey, you!" "Hey," he said, voice soft. "Just wanted to hear your voice." "I know," she said. "How was the flight?" "Long, good. I saw someone last night, at the airport." Looked just like her. A pause. Then gently, and it didn't break me. It reminded me that love doesn't disappear, it just changes shape. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm proud of you, he smiled. I'm proud of us. For still being here. They talked for a while about nothing important, really. The weather, a silly thing their dog did, an old movie they both loved. But it was the kind of talk that mended things without saying so. The kind that said, I'm here. You're not alone. After they hung up, he stayed on the bench a little longer. The sun had risen fully now, casting long golden shadows across the snow. Kids were arriving at the nearby school, laughing, shoving each other playfully, zipping up their coats against the cold. He watched them and felt something warm bloom in his chest. Not sadness, not longing, but hope. Not the loud, dramatic kind, but the quiet kind that grows in ordinary moments. The kind that says life goes on, and that's beautiful. Back at the hotel, he showered, dressed in simple clothes, dark sweater, jeans, boots, and walked to the theater. The event organizer met him in the lobby, nervous but kind. We're so honored you came, she said, wringing her hands slightly. The audience, they really love this film. And you, he nodded. Thanks for having me. There was no green room, no fancy setup. Just a small backstage area with a folding chair and a bottle of water. He sat quietly, listening to the murmur of the crowd gathering in the auditorium. He could hear excited whispers, the rustle of programs, the occasional laugh. These were people who loved stories, who believed in the power of film to connect, to heal, to remind us we're not alone. When it was time, he walked on stage to warm applause. No fanfare, no introduction. Just him, a microphone, and a room full of faces lit by the soft glow of the screen behind him. He didn't give a speech. He just answered questions about the craft, the challenges, the joy of making something that lasts. When someone asked how he stayed grounded in an industry full of noise, he paused, then said simply, by remembering what matters. People. Kindness. Showing up, even when it's hard. No one knew he was talking about more than just acting, but maybe some did. Maybe they heard the truth beneath the words. Afterward, a few people lined up to say thank you. An older man with tired eyes said, my wife passed last year. Your work got me through some dark nights. A young woman barely out of college whispered, you make me believe good people still exist. He listened to each one, looked them in the eye, said their names when they told them, held their hands if they reached out. Not as a star, but as a human being who understood loss, who believed in connection. Later, walking back to the hotel in the cold evening air, he felt lighter than he had in years. Not because the past was gone, it never would be, but because he'd carried it with grace today. He hadn't hidden from it. He'd let it walk beside him like an old friend, and in doing so, he'd made space for something else. Peace. Not the kind that comes from forgetting, but the kind that comes from remembering and choosing to live anyway. The flight back to Los Angeles left late the next evening. Keanu sat by the window again, but this time he wasn't watching the ground disappear. He was watching the sky open up. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the clouds in streaks of rose and lavender. He leaned his head against the cool glass and closed his eyes, not to sleep but to feel the quiet hum of the plane, the steady rhythm of engines carrying him home. The past 2 days had been simple. No headlines, no chaos, just a screening, a few honest conversations, and long walks through a city that didn't ask anything of him. And somehow in that simplicity, something had shifted inside him, not dramatically, not with fireworks, but like a stone settling in calm water, the kind of shift that doesn't announce itself but changes everything anyway. He thought about the woman at the airport again, not with longing, but with gratitude. She hadn't been a ghost. She'd been a mirror, and in that mirror he'd seen not just who he'd lost, but who he'd become because of her. The kindness he carried, the patience he practiced, the way he still believed in love even after it had broken his heart. That was her too, not just in memory but in action. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his notebook. Flipped to the page where he'd written those 3 lines. Beneath them he added one more, and that's how she stays alive. He didn't need to say her name out loud. It lived in the way he paused before speaking, in the way he held doors for strangers, in the way he still made 2 cups of tea sometimes, just because the ritual felt like keeping a promise. The cabin lights dimmed. Passengers around him settled in for the night. Headphones on, blankets pulled up, eyes already heavy. Keanu stayed awake, watching as the last light faded and stars began to dot the sky. Up here, there were no distractions. No phones buzzing, no demands, no expectations. Just silence, space, and the vast, quiet beauty of the world below. He remembered something his father once told him, years ago, on a rare visit. You don't honor the dead by stopping. You honor them by living well. At the time, it had sounded like empty advice. Now it felt like truth carved into bone. He thought about Ava, his daughter he never got to hold. He used to imagine her in painful detail. Her first steps, her first word, the way she might have looked at him with Jennifer's eyes. But lately he'd stopped trying to fill in the blanks. Instead, he honored her by supporting causes that helped other children. Hospitals, education, safe spaces for families in crisis. He never talked about it, didn't need to. It was his quiet way of saying, you mattered. And because you did, I'll help others matter too. That was love. Not the grand, sweeping kind people wrote songs about, but the steady, daily kind that shows up when no one's watching. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, just a gentle bump. A child in the row ahead whimpered softly, and a parent's hand reached out to squeeze theirs. Keanu watched the small gesture, the instinct to comfort, to protect, and felt something warm rise in his chest. That was it. That was everything. The whole point of being here, to care, to connect, to ease someone else's burden, even in the tiniest way. He thought about all the people who'd reached out to him over the years, not for autographs, but because his work or his silence or his kindness had touched them in a hard time. He never knew how to respond. He'd just say, I'm glad it helped, and mean it. But now he understood it wasn't about him. It was about the shared human experience, the loneliness, the hope, the ache for something real. And sometimes just showing up as yourself was enough to remind someone they weren't alone. The flight attendant came by with water. He accepted it with a nod and a quiet, thank you. She paused for just a second, then said, You seem lighter tonight. He looked up, surprised. Do I? She smiled. Yeah, like you let something go. He didn't answer right away. Then softly, maybe I did. She moved on, but her words stayed with him. Had he let something go? Not the love, that would always be there. But maybe the weight of carrying it like a wound. Maybe he'd finally allowed it to be a part of him, not a chain around his neck. As the plane leveled out again, he leaned back and let his thoughts drift. He pictured the house in Silver Lake, not with sadness, but with tenderness. One day he'd go back. Not to live there, but to sit on the porch one last time, say goodbye properly, and leave a single white rose by the lemon tree, not as a farewell, but as a thank you for the love, for the time they had, for the lessons that still guided him. He thought about the future, too, not with fear, but with openness. He didn't know what came next. Maybe more films, maybe quieter years, maybe long rides on his motorcycle, stopping in small towns just to talk to people at diners. Whatever it was, he wanted to meet it with the same honesty he'd shown in that airport hallway. Because that's what mattered. Not fame, not legacy, not even healing completely, but showing up raw, real, and willing to feel it all. Hours passed. The sky outside turned from black to deep blue, then to the soft gray of early morning. Lights began to appear below, first scattered, then dense, then familiar. Los Angeles. Home. The plane descended slowly, gliding over hills and freeways and neighborhoods still wrapped in sleep. Keanu watched the city grow larger, his reflection faint in the window. He saw his own face, older, quieter, marked by time, but also saw something else. Peace. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of acceptance. The wheels touched down with a gentle thud. The cabin lights brightened. People stirred, stretching, gathering bags, checking phones. Keanu stayed seated for a moment, letting the moment settle. He wasn't rushing anywhere. For the first time in a long time, he felt exactly where he needed to be. He walked through the terminal slowly, duffel slung over his shoulder. No one stopped him. No one stared. He passed the same gate where he'd seen her, the woman who looked like Jennifer, and paused for just a breath. The space was empty now, just chairs and quiet. But it didn't feel haunted. It felt sacred, a place where grief and grace had met and parted as friends. Outside, the California air was warm even at dawn. He hailed a cab, gave the driver his address, and leaned back as the city woke around him. Palm trees swayed in the breeze. A street sweeper rumbled down the avenue. Somewhere a bakery was opening, the smell of fresh bread drifting into the air. He rolled down the window and let the wind brush his face. He wasn't running from the past anymore. He wasn't chasing ghosts, he was walking forward, with love in his pocket, memory in his bones, and a heart that had learned finally how to carry both joy and sorrow at the same time. And that was enough. More than enough. It was life. Real. Messy, beautiful life, and he was still here to live it. He didn't go straight home after the cab dropped him off. Instead, he walked. The sun was fully up now, casting long golden shadows across the quiet streets of his neighborhood. Birds called from the trees. A neighbor was watering plants on their porch, humming softly to themselves. Everything felt ordinary, and that was exactly what he needed. His house was modest, tucked away from the noise of the city, surrounded by tall hedges and a small garden he tended himself. He hadn't hired a gardener in years. There was something grounding about digging his hands into the soil, pulling weeds, watching things grow because of care, not because of luck. It reminded him that life responded to attention, even after loss, especially after loss. He unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The air smelled like old books, cedar, and the faint trace of coffee from the day before. Nothing fancy. No designer furniture, no flashy art. Just a worn couch, a shelf full of well-read paperbacks, a guitar in the corner he rarely played but kept tuned just in case. This was his sanctuary, not because it was perfect but because it was honest. He dropped his duffel by the door and walked straight to the kitchen, filled the kettle, lit the stove. While he waited for the water to boil, he stood by the window, watching a hummingbird hover near the potted jasmine on the sill. It darted away as quickly as it came, leaving only the memory of wings. The kettle whistled. He made tea, loose leaf steeped just right, and carried the mug to the backyard. The morning sun warmed the wooden bench under the oak tree. He sat, wrapped his hands around the cup, and let the steam rise into his face. For the first time in days, he felt still. Not numb. Not distracted. Just still. He thought about the last few days, the airport, the flight, the quiet conversations in Toronto, the way strangers had looked at him not as a famous face, but as a person carrying something heavy, and how instead of hiding he'd let them see it. Just a little, just enough. That was the thing about grief, he realized. It didn't need to be fixed. It just needed to be witnessed. And sometimes the bravest thing you could do was let someone else see it, even if only for a moment. He sipped his tea. The warmth spread through his chest, slow and steady. Later he showered, changed into soft clothes, and sat at his small desk by the window. He opened his notebook again, not to write, but to read. Page after page filled with fragments, quotes from poets, sketches of cityscapes, notes from film sets, reminders to call a friend, to donate to a shelter, to check in on someone who'd lost a parent. And tucked between the pages, that one photo, Jennifer laughing in the kitchen, sunlight in her hair. He didn't cry. He just looked at her for a long time, really looked, and whispered, "I'm okay." It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a performance. It was a quiet truth spoken into the space between then and now. He closed the notebook and placed it back in the drawer. Then he picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for the children's hospital he'd supported for years. He called the director, a woman he'd never met in person, but who always answered his calls. "It's me," he said when she picked up. "I know," she replied, voice warm. "We've been wondering if you'd call." "I want to visit," he said. "Not for photos. Not for press, just to see the kids." "If that's okay." There was a pause. Then gently, "They'd love that. Especially the ones in the long-term wing. They talk about you like you're a superhero." He smiled faintly. "I'm not. But I'll come." They set a date for the following week. No fanfare, no announcement. Just a man showing up with books, toys, and time to sit and listen. After the call, he walked back outside. The sun was higher now, the air warmer. He knelt by the garden and began pulling weeds, his hands sinking into the damp earth. It was messy work. Quiet work. The kind that didn't ask for applause, only presence. As he worked, he thought about the woman at the airport, not as a mystery, but as a gift. She hadn't been Jennifer, but she'd been a reminder that love doesn't vanish. It echoes. In faces, in gestures, in the way one stranger's kindness can stitch a moment back together. And maybe that's how healing happened. Not in one big leap, but in 1,000 small returns. Coming back to your breath. Coming back to your hands in the soil. Coming back to the table with a cup of tea and the courage to say, I'm still here. He stood, brushing dirt from his knees, and walked to the lemon tree in the far corner of the yard. It still hadn't borne fruit after all these years, but it was alive, green, strong. It didn't need to produce lemons to be worthy of care. It just needed to be. He touched one of its leaves, rough and fragrant, and smiled. Later that afternoon, he rode his motorcycle out to the coast. Not for speed, not for escape, but for the wind, the open road, the smell of salt and pine. He parked near a quiet stretch of beach, took off his helmet, and walked barefoot along the shore. The waves rolled in, steady and patient as if they'd been waiting for him. He sat on a smooth rock and watched the horizon. No thoughts, no plans. Just the sound of water, the cry of gulls, the sun on his skin. In that moment he felt it. Not happiness, not sadness, but something deeper. Belonging. Not to a place, but to life itself. To the messy, beautiful, heartbreaking, hopeful act of being human. He stayed until the sun began to dip, painting the sky in gold and violet. Then he stood, brushed the sand from his jeans, and walked back to his bike. On the ride home, the city lights began to flicker on one by one. He didn't rush. He let the night wrap around him like a familiar coat. When he got back, he made a simple dinner. Pasta, garlic, olive oil, a little red wine. Ate at the kitchen table, listening to an old jazz record playing softly from the other room. Afterward, he washed the dishes by hand, dried them slowly, put them away. Before bed, he stood on the porch for a while looking up at the stars. The same stars he'd seen from the plane. The same stars that had watched over Jennifer, over Ava, over every person who'd ever loved and lost and kept going anyway. He whispered goodnight, not to ghosts, but to the love that still lived in him. Then he went inside, turned off the lights, and climbed into bed. The house was quiet. The world was quiet, and for the first time in a long time, the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt full, full of memory, full of peace, full of a life still being lived, with tenderness, with courage, and with an open heart. He closed his eyes and slept.